February 1943. The cold air hung heavy in the streets of the Warsaw Ghetto, a suffocating silence blanketing the city's heart. Snow had fallen the night before, but it had done little to hide the scars of destruction. The walls of the ghetto, once sturdy, now seemed fragile like the lives of those within. Children ran between makeshift barricades, their laughter bitter, because they knew, even if they didn't understand fully, that the future held nothing for them. Inside the crumbling walls of an orphanage, Dr. Janusz Korczak worked tirelessly, moving from bed to bed, soothing the children with soft words, his fingers steady despite the ever-present dread in the air. He was a man of his word. A pediatrician, yes, but more importantly, a guardian, a protector. The children he cared for weren't simply patients. They were his family. Their needs, their well-being became his life. Each child under his roof, each of their faces, he held them as one holds onto the threads of hope in a world that had long since lost its way. But hope had become a rare commodity in the ghetto. The Nazis, ever encroaching, had made their intentions clear. Deportation was not just a rumor. It was an inevitability. The children would be taken, sent to the camps, and murdered. There was no escaping it. Dr. Korczak knew this. They all knew this. But in the quietest of moments, when he allowed himself to think, he wondered if it might be easier to leave, to save himself. After all, they had offered him freedom, a life away from the suffering that had become his daily reality. The decision had come to him not through a grand proclamation, but through a quiet whisper from a Nazi officer, a chance to escape the horrors that awaited the children. He was told that he could leave the ghetto, that he could survive. All he had to do was abandon the children, his orphanage, and live. The offer was tempting. It was not made out of kindness, but rather out of practicality. The Nazis had no use for a man who dedicated his life to children. And while the officer's words were carefully measured, as though trying to entice Korczak into compliance, the gravity of the offer hit him like a punch to the gut. Leave the children. Save himself. It seemed simple enough. In a world where morality was drowned under the weight of survival, perhaps this was the sensible choice. But Dr. Korczak couldn't allow himself the luxury of that choice. His children, those pale faces that looked to him for answers, were the last vestiges of innocence in a world destroyed by madness. They were the embodiment of humanity's best qualities: trust, loyalty, love. How could he abandon them now? How could he leave them to their fate, knowing what awaited them behind the barbed wire and gas chambers? He had taken an oath, not just as a doctor, but as their protector, to guide them through a world that had become monstrous. And in that moment, Korczak understood the brutal paradox of his position. He was a man who had already lost everything. His family had been murdered by the Nazis. His city was no longer his own. And now, his last responsibility, the children, was being taken from him. To refuse the officer's offer was not just an act of defiance. It was an act of radical humanity. Korczak knew the risks. He understood the horrors that awaited him if he stayed. But what was the point of survival if he could not protect those who needed him most? Was life worth living if it was not shared with others? Was survival even possible if it meant surrendering one's soul? That night, as he sat alone in his office, the weight of the decision settled upon him like a crushing burden. The sounds of the ghetto seemed to grow quieter, as if the world itself were holding its breath. He stared at the worn desk, the letters from families of lost children stacked high. Each one a letter he had never been able to respond to. Each one a testament to the silence that would soon swallow the orphanage. It was a decision he had to make, one way or the other. But as Korczak stood up and walked to the orphanage's courtyard, a deep, unsettling thought gnawed at him. Could he ever live with himself if he abandoned them? Would he be able to stand in front of a mirror again, seeing only a man who chose survival over his morals? The thought haunted him. The children had become the heartbeat of his life. Every night, after the work was done, Korczak would gather them together in the makeshift dining hall. They would sit around a simple table, and he would read to them fairy tales, stories of adventure and whimsy, anything that could offer them a brief respite from the nightmare they lived. There were nights when the air was thick with tension, and the children would ask, "Doctor, will they come tonight?" Korchak would smile gently, shake his head, and reassure them, "Not tonight, my children, not tonight." But he knew better. He could feel the creeping terror in the air, could sense that the time was drawing near. The children's questions were not those of naivety, but of the knowing. They had been raised in the shadow of death, and still they trusted him to make it right. The weight of that trust was unbearable. Dr. Korchak made his decision not just as a doctor, but as a man, as a human being who could not bear the thought of turning his back on innocence. The Nazis had robbed him of everything, his home, his family, his safety, but they could not steal his integrity. They could not make him a coward. They could not take from him the one thing that defined his humanity, his choice to care. And so he refused. He refused the chance to leave, the chance to survive. He chose to stay with the children, to stay with the most vulnerable, the most innocent, in a world that had grown increasingly hostile. It was an act of sheer defiance, a refusal to allow history to erase them, to make them invisible in the eyes of those who had already decided their fate. The officer who had offered him his freedom didn't understand. His words had no effect. The officer left, perhaps confused, perhaps disappointed. But Korchak knew what he had done. He had chosen humanity over survival. And in doing so, he made an enemy of the very system that sought to control him. They wanted to break him. They wanted to destroy him. But Korchak was not a man who could be destroyed by fear. He had already endured the loss of everything he held dear. He had already known what it meant to be powerless, to be vulnerable. And in that powerlessness, he found something greater, the strength to resist. The days that followed were filled with a haunting calm. The children sensed that something was coming, but they didn't know what. There was a strange, almost tranquil quality to the way the days passed. They spent their time making small drawings, playing games, and learning. It was as if Dr. Korchak had become their protector, not just from the external horrors of the world, but from the despair that threatened to engulf them. But even as he continued to care for them, his heart remained heavy with the knowledge that their fate was sealed. The Nazis would not allow him to defy them forever. The children would be taken. Their time was running out. And yet, in those final days, Korchak stood as the unwavering guardian, refusing to surrender his humanity, even in the face of inevitable death. August 1942. The sun had barely risen over the Warsaw Ghetto, but the air already felt oppressive, like the weight of 1,000 unspeakable truths pressing down on the fragile world contained within its walls. The silence that often gripped the ghetto had shifted, becoming heavier, more tangible. Dr. Janusz Korchak could feel it, the air thick with a suffocating sense of finality. The rumors were no longer just whispers. They were facts now, confirmed by the hasty, ever-present Nazi patrols, the black-gloved men with their death-stare eyes. It was inevitable. The children, the very lives he had spent years protecting, would be taken. Deportation had become a daily word in the ghetto. It hung over them, a shadow that could no longer be avoided. Inside the orphanage, there was a strange calm. The children, still unaware of the precise horror that awaited them, moved around the compound with an innocence that could not yet be shattered. They played their games, drew pictures, and told stories, as though the world outside the walls of the orphanage had not completely crumbled away. Dr. Korchak had become a central figure in their fragile universe. More than just a doctor, he was their father, their protector. He had given up his own life to care for them, sacrificing everything, and they knew nothing but his unwavering presence. His office, though simple and cluttered with papers, was filled with the sound of children's laughter, of questions, of requests for stories or to be read to. These were the moments that Korchak clung to, moments of normalcy that made the brutality of the world outside seem like a distant memory. But even in the heart of the orphanage, Korchak knew that time was running out. The Nazis had begun their systematic destruction of the ghetto, rounding up entire families, sending them to the death camps that lurked beyond the city's walls. The children, like all others in the ghetto, were seen as dispensable. Their lives meant nothing to the men who had already begun the process of erasing entire communities entire cultures with cold efficiency. Dr. Korchak knew that soon his orphanage, his refuge, would be swept up in the chaos, its walls reduced to rubble, its children sent to their graves. But what could one man do in the face of such overwhelming evil? The question had plagued Korchak for weeks, gnawing at his mind as he fought to maintain some semblance of hope. He could not stop the inevitable, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could delay it. Perhaps he could find a way to shield his children from the terror that was coming. One evening, as dusk began to settle over the ghetto, Korchak gathered the children together in the courtyard. They sat on the cold stone steps, their eyes wide and trusting, unaware of the darkness that was slowly encroaching on their lives. Korchak stood before them, his heart heavy, as he watched their faces, their untainted smiles. He could not break their spirit, not yet. He cleared his throat and spoke in his gentle, measured tone. "My dear children, soon you may find yourselves in strange places. It will be hard. It will be very hard. But remember this, we are all together. Nothing can take away our love for one another. And no matter where we go, we will be with each other." The children nodded solemnly, as if they understood, though they could not have possibly known what Korchak was preparing them for. The truth was, Korchak was preparing himself for what was coming as much as he was preparing them. He had seen enough. He knew the Nazis were not interested in negotiation, that no amount of pleading would save them. The only way to preserve even a shred of dignity for these children was to maintain their humanity until the end. They would not go quietly, not without a fight, even if that fight meant walking into the jaws of death with heads held high. But Korchak could feel the weight of his decision settling over him. The children had been with him for so long that they were not just orphans to him anymore. They were his family. He had made a promise to each of them, though perhaps none of them had fully understood it at the time. His promise was simple: "I will never leave you, no matter what." The following morning, the inevitable happened. The sound of marching boots filled the air. The children, for the first time, looked to him with genuine fear. They could hear the Nazi officers shouting orders, their voices cold and distant. The time had come. The children were being rounded up for deportation, and there was nothing Dr. Korchak could do to stop it. Korchak had been offered a way out. Just like before, the Nazis had offered him his freedom. "You don't have to stay here," they had said. "Leave the children behind. You can save yourself." But Korchak was resolute. He would not abandon them. His children would be taken, but they would not be taken alone. Not while he was there to protect them. He would stand with them to the very end. The officer came to him with the order. The children were to be moved to the Umschlagplatz, the deportation point where families would be sent away in cattle cars to the death camps. The officer's words were almost mechanical, a mere formality in a world that had become numb to the tragedy unfolding around them. But Korchak, with a calmness that belied the tension in his chest, nodded in acceptance. He had no choice. There was nothing left to negotiate. The children would go, but they would not go without him. And so, the march began. The children were assembled in groups, their faces pale and apprehensive. They held hands tightly, as if that small, fragile connection might somehow shield them from the horrors that awaited. Korchak walked beside them, his figure straight, his heart heavy. The officers were watching him, their faces expressionless, but Korchak could see the contempt in their eyes. They did not understand his resolve. They could not fathom the depths of the bond he had with these children. As they reached the gates of the ghetto, Korchak could hear the cries of families being torn apart, the final goodbyes that would never be honored. But he did not falter. He kept walking, one foot in front of the other, his eyes focused ahead. The children, though confused and frightened, trusted him. They followed him, their small hands gripping his coat, their steps tentative but resolute. The march to the Umschlagplatz was long and grueling, the weight of each step dragging them closer to the reality they had been desperately trying to avoid. The sound of the marching boots was deafening now, the rhythm of the soldiers' steps merging with the footsteps of the doomed. Korchak could hear the whispers of the children, asking questions that broke his heart. "Doctor, where are we going? Why are we leaving?" He answered them as best as he could, his voice steady but breaking with the weight of the lies he had to tell. "We're going to a new place, a better place," he said, though he knew it wasn't true. When they arrived at the Umschlagplatz, the chaos of the deportation was overwhelming. There were other groups of people, families, all being herded together like cattle. The sounds of panic, of wailing mothers, filled the air. And through it all, Dr. Korchak remained by the children's side. He did not look back at the officers, did not try to plead for their lives. There was no point. There was no salvation to be found here. He could only hold onto the children, guide them, and walk beside them as they faced their fate. And as they were marched onto the trains that would take them to their deaths, Dr. Korchak's final act was one of dignity. He did not break down. He did not beg for mercy. He held his head high, walking with the children, the last protector of innocence, as they disappeared into the night. In the end, they were all taken. Korchak, the children, the innocence of a generation, all of them. The ghetto would never forget, but history would try to erase their names. They were among the forgotten, the erased. But for Korchak, the question was never whether he had done enough. He had done what he could. In a world consumed by madness, he had shown the one thing that could not be destroyed: love, even in the face of annihilation. August 5, 1942. The morning was gray, the sky heavy with the kind of oppressive silence that accompanies tragedy. Dr. Janusz Korchak stood among the children of the orphanage, his heart as heavy as the clouds above. The air in the ghetto was thick with fear, and the sound of boots marching had become a constant presence, an unrelenting reminder of the fate that loomed over them all. The children, who had once looked to him for comfort and answers, now gazed up at him with confusion and a deep, unspoken fear. It was the same fear they had seen reflected in his eyes, but never truly understood until now. This time, they could no longer shield themselves from the inevitable. Korchak had spent the past months preparing them, trying to keep some semblance of normalcy in their lives. He had read them stories of distant lands, played games with them, and even taught them lessons about life, love, and survival, though those lessons had grown increasingly hollow as the walls of the ghetto closed in tighter. The laughter that had once filled the orphanage had dwindled to a faint echo, drowned out by the brutal reality of their situation. He had given them all he had, his time, his love, his hope. But now, even his strength seemed to falter in the face of what was coming. The deportations had begun. The children were being taken, one group at a time, to the Umschlagplatz, the place where they would be loaded onto trains that would take them to their deaths. Dr. Korchak had been told that he could escape. He could leave the ghetto, walk away from the nightmare that was unfolding. But he had refused again and again. His place was here, with the children, and he would not abandon them. Not now, not when the end had arrived. There was no escape, no chance for survival in a world where death had become the only certainty.